Hi, welcome to Lies and Secrets channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. The Ian house was saturated with a profound silence as if it were draped over the walls. Like the shadows of forgotten memories, it enveloped everything from the furniture to the bookshelves. At times, Luna could almost convince herself she still heard the echo of his footsteps in the corridor, his voice softly harmonizing the tunes they once sang together, the gentle creak of his chair at the dinner table. Benjamin had been absent for 3 years now, and although the world outside had continued its relentless march forward within her small home, time seemed to have paused indefinitely. Luna, a woman who had always taken pride in her resilience, found herself feeling fragile after Jacques' departure. Her once strong resolve now seemed like a fragile veneer, threatening to shatter under the weight of solitude. Repeatedly, she reassured herself that she would manage, that life would become more bearable, yet it didn't. The void left by his absence was a persistent ache in her ***T, one that refused to fade despite her attempts to distract herself. Therapy sessions provided some relief, but never quite sufficed. The sorrow lingered, a quiet, insistent shadow, trailing her from room to room. She often reflected on the old house they had crafted together, a place still imbued with his essence. Then one day a thought appeared to her as if out of nowhere, taking root in her mind. "A dog," she murmured to herself while standing in the living room, gazing out at the distant street. Perhaps that was what she needed. Although she had never been particularly fond of animals, unlike Benjamin, the growing loneliness was becoming intolerable, and perhaps a companion might help. Deciding to take action, she contacted the local shelter that very afternoon. The ensuing days were a whirlwind. She visited the shelter, scanning the big dogs, considering which might be her new companion. Each dog's eyes seemed to silently beseech her, but it wasn't until she encountered Alexander that something shifted within her. Alexander was far from the cutest dog there, a mixed breed with unkempt, shaggy fur and eyes. Too intelligent for his scruffy demeanor, Alexander didn't leap or wag his tail. When she approached, he merely observed her, tilting his head as if assessing her. Then, unexpectedly, he nudged his nose against the cage bars, quietly requesting her attention. Instinctively, Luna reached out, and by that afternoon, Alexander had a new home with her. His paws patted softly as he explored the house, sniffing and marking his new territory. With the excitement of a fresh start, Luna followed her heart, a mix of excitement and apprehension. She appreciated his presence, the way he breathed life back into the home. That first night, she let Alexander sleep beside her, anticipating awkwardness, sharing her bed with an unfamiliar creature. She was surprised by how natural it felt. Alexander nestled against her, his head resting at her side, and for the first time in months, Luna felt a flicker of warmth. His presence was soothing, his breathing a gentle lullaby that lulled her into relaxation. As she drifted to sleep to the sound of Alexander's soft snoring, a sense of peace washed over her, as if the world had begun to realign. In her newfound routine, Luna managed to let go of the persistent ache that had settled in her heart, the void that Benjamin had left, and the years of sorrow that had burdened her. Now her focus was on Alexander, her new companion in the peculiar, serene world she had crafted for herself. Over the following weeks, Alexander transformed from just a pet into a steadfast companion, a confidant who was always there when solitude felt overwhelming. His unwavering presence offered solace, whether through a wagging tail or a gentle nudge. Luna found herself speaking to him as if he could comprehend every word, as if he could somehow fill the emptiness left by Benjamin. During quiet moments in the living room, either engrossed in a book or watching LED TV, Alexander would be at her feet, his eyes always fixed on her. Times like these, Luna couldn't help but imagine that perhaps Benjamin was watching over them, that he had somehow sent Alexander to aid her healing process. One evening, after an especially taxing day, Luna found herself in the kitchen with Alexander trailing closely behind. She poured herself a glass of wine, and as she turned to return to the living room, she noticed Alexander sitting by her feet, gazing up at her with his soulful brown eyes. "I honestly don't know what I'd do without you, Alexander," she murmured. Absent scratching behind his ears, Alexander's tail gently thumped against the floor. As if acknowledging her sentiment, Luna smiled at him, her heart warming, and for the first time in ages she felt a glimmer of hope. Little did she realize this unassuming dog was on the verge of transforming her life entirely. As days turned into weeks, Luna's bond with Alexander deepened. He became more than just a pet. He was her companion and confidant. At night she welcomed him into her bed, his warmth a comforting balm to her loneliness. In those still nights, Luna's thoughts drifted from Benjamin to Alexander. Whispering Alexander's name felt like calling out to Benjamin, and occasionally she sensed a response, a subtle shift in the air, a gentle warmth against her skin. Sometimes she entertained the notion that Alexander was more than just a dog, that perhaps he was Benjamin returned in a new form. This fleeting thought was quickly dismissed. Yet the more time she spent with Alexander, the harder it was to ignore the feeling that he was filling the space Shock had left behind. Sitting on the couch one evening with Alexander nestled beside her and her hand resting on his head, Luna couldn't help but smile. Perhaps this was what she had been yearning for all along. The comfort of companionship, the simple joy of having someone by her side again, yet a quiet voice in her mind reminded her that things were not as uncomplicated as they seemed for now. Though Luna chose to ignore that voice, content to savor the warmth of the moment with Alexander beside her. Days blended into weeks, and Luna's life settled into a simple rhythmic pattern. Each morning began with a walk with Alexander, followed by feeding him, letting him out into the yard, and spending the rest of the day together. The early mornings were enveloped in a quiet, so profound it seemed audible, heavy like a thick blanket. Luna had grown accustomed to it. The silence no longer a source of discomfort with Alexander's quiet yet steady presence. He had brought stability to the tumult of her emotions, but there was something else, a realization that was slowly dawning on Luna, one she had yet to fully comprehend. Until now, Luna hadn't fully realized how much she had come to lean on Alexander. Her emotional stability, once so intricately linked to Benjamin, was now almost entirely anchored to her canine companion. She started noticing the little things, the way Alexander shadowed her throughout the house, his loyal eyes tracking her every move, making her feel like the focal point of his universe. It was a kind of attention she was unaccustomed to but found surprisingly reassuring. Each night as she slipped into bed, Alexander would nestle close, his warm presence a comforting constant. What began as a means for him to feel secure and keep her company had transformed into an unspoken nightly ritual. Luna, who had always been wary of forming attachments, especially to something transient, found that with Alexander the bond had deepened so naturally, so quietly, that she was unaware of its full extent until it was too late. One evening, while Luna was absorbed in a book on the couch, Alexander hopped up beside her, resting his head in her lap. Her hand moved through his fur, absent-minded as she drifted into her thoughts. The world outside faded into the background. Significance dimmed. She reflected on Benjamin, the absence of his voice, and how life had moved forward without her, leaving her behind in a house filled with echoes of the past. Yet Alexander's presence seemed to fill that void, his warmth seeping into the empty spaces. She briefly wondered if he could grasp the depth of her sorrow, if he could sense Benjamin's lingering essence in the corners of their home. It was a fleeting notion, one she dismissed almost as soon as it crossed her mind. After all, Alexander was just a dog, or so she told herself. This change was subtle, at first hardly noticeable. It began with minor, almost trivial shifts, Alexander's insistence on closeness, his nocturnal nudges becoming more frequent, more deliberate. Initially, Luna thought little of it. Big dogs are naturally affectionate, and Alexander had always been a bit clingy. But now she noticed how much more present he seemed. One evening after a late return from a meeting, she found Alexander by the door as if he had been waiting for her. Instead of greeting her with his usual wagging tail, he just stared, his dark eyes following her movements. "Hey, Alexander," she said, attempting to dispel the tension that crept up her spine. He didn't respond, his gaze unwavering. There was something different in his stare, something that made her pause, her heart skipping a beat. She attributed it to her own fatigue, perhaps an overactive imagination, but the feeling lingered, hovering just beyond her conscious understanding. The following days were filled with more of the same. Alexander was perpetually at her side, almost too much, so she couldn't comprehend why he had become so insistent. On being near her in the kitchen, he sat by the door, his eyes fixed on her. When she went to the bathroom, she would find him waiting outside the door. It wasn't that he was demanding. It was the intensity of his attention that began to unsettle her. Alexander seemed to be watching her in a way that transcended mere curiosity. Felt as though he was anticipating something, waiting for a moment. She couldn't quite grasp. One night, Clara awoke to find Alexander at the edge of the bed, his face mere inches from hers, his presence a silent sentinel in the dark. His breath was a gentle whisper against her skin, yet his eyes remained wide and fixed on her. Blinking in confusion, Luna felt a soft nudge from Alexander's nose against her cheek, drawing himself closer. "Alexander," she murmured, her voice still tinged with the haze of sleep. He remained steadfast, not pulling away, his body nestled against hers with a protective warmth. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just his comforting presence. Luna began to relax into the sensation. Though a lingering thought hovered at the edge of her consciousness, she wasn't accustomed to this kind of attention, least of all from a dog. Yet, as the nights unfolded, this pattern continued. Alexander would join her in bed, curling up beside her, his proximity feeling unusually intimate, as if he were marking his territory around her. Occasionally, she would awaken in the night to find him nudging her, trying to edge even closer. This wasn't the typical snuggling behavior she expected from a dog. Initially, Luna dismissed it, chalking it up to Alexander's affectionate nature, but the more she pondered it, the more unsettled she became, unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss. Her logical mind insisted it was merely her loneliness, her yearning for connection causing her to overanalyze Alexander's actions. Yet deep down, she sensed a change between them, one she couldn't fully articulate. Luna endeavored to ignore the growing tension, reluctant to delve too deeply into it, especially given how much she depended on Alexander's companionship. She feared confronting the truth, worried that her feelings for him were evolving into something more complex than simple affection. Nonetheless, the burgeoning intimacy was undeniable. Alexander began reacting to her emotions in ways that seemed almost human. When sadness engulfed her, he would stay close, resting his head on her lap, eyes brimming with empathy. In moments of laughter, he would brighten as though sharing in her joy. These interactions forged a profound bond, transcending the conventional pet-owner dynamic. Then, on a chilly winter evening, Luna sat by the fireplace. When Alexander joined her, he nudged her hand, prompting her to absent-minded scratch behind his ears. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes, but this time felt different. He wasn't merely seeking affection. He appeared to be waiting, as if anticipating an impending revelation. As she leaned down to K***** his head, she glimpsed something in his eyes that made her heart skip a spark of recognition, an understanding that seemed beyond what she expected from a dog. Chill course. Through her, Luna had always prided herself on her independence, building her life around self-sufficiency, career, and French ***s, managing her emotions in solitude. Yet since Alexander's arrival, something fundamental had shifted. Quiet moments of her day, once tinged with loneliness, were now accompanied by the comforting patter of Alexander's paws on the hardwood, his rhythmic panting. As he settled by her feet, he had become more than a companion. He was her anchor each morning, as the first rays of sun filtered through the curtains. Alexander was there waiting patiently for her to stir. He didn't clamor for attention like other big dogs. His presence was subtle yet unmistakable. It was in the gentle way he nudged her hand or rested his head in her lap as she sat on the couch, a silent testament to their growing bond. She found solace in Alexander's presence. Yet as time passed, she realized just how much she depended on his affection, especially in the void left by Benjamin. The house, once filled with Benjamin laughter and presence, had grown quieter, but Alexander seemed to occupy this emptiness with an uncanny completeness. his constant presence following her from room to room. Those big brown eyes, always watching her with an understanding gaze, made Luna feel as if he comprehended her grief. Seemed improbable that a dog could grasp something as nuanced as sorrow, yet she couldn't dismiss the thought. Alexander's gentle demeanor and calming nature acted as a soothing balm for her wounded heart. Gradually, she began seeing him less as a pet and more as a true companion. Always there when she needed him. At night, Alexander would nestle at the foot of her bed, his warmth of comforting closeness. On occasion, she would wake in the middle of the night to find him near her head, his soft breath against her ear, his eyes open and vigilant, almost as if he were watching over her. The intensity of his gaze was something Luna couldn't quite put into words. He wasn't just a dog, she pondered. He seemed to be something beyond that. Someone who understood her in a way no one else could. Yet amid this growing attachment, an underlying unease began to surface. Although she couldn't quite identify it, it manifested in small, subtle ways. Alexander's insistence on remaining close to her, even during mundane tasks like brushing her teeth or folding laundry, wasn't overly needy, but carried a constancy that was starting to feel excessive. One night, as Luna settled into bed, she noticed Alexander perched by her nightstand, his eyes fixed on her. There was no wagging tail, no playful antics. He simply observed her as if anticipating something. "Alexander, what is it?" she whispered, but there was no response. Instead, he patted closer, curling up beside her, resting his head on her pillow. Luna hesitated, a chill tingling down her spine. She wasn't sure why, but this moment felt peculiar. Proximity, the way he sought her comfort, seemed too intimate for a pat. "Maybe I'm just imagining things," she muttered, dismissing the unease. Yet as she drifted into sleep, Alexander remained steadfast at her side. His warmth and unwavering presence, the days continued in this pattern, with Alexander ever present, never straying far. Luna tried to immerse herself in work, social activities, and hobbies. But Alexander's presence was a constant, like a shadow in her periphery. It reached a point where she felt she couldn't breathe without him. He had become an integral part of her life, a fixture she couldn't envision living without, and that realization unnerved her. It wasn't until a rainy evening 3 weeks later that Luna truly grasped the depth of their emotional bond. After returning home late from a work event, exhausted and weary, she found Alexander waiting at the door as if he had been anticipating her arrival. His eyes were wide, expectant, and there was something different in them this time, something almost knowing. "Hey there," Buddy, Luna said softly, trying to dispel the growing tension in her stomach. She crouched to pet him, but Alexander didn't immediately respond. Instead, he held her gaze, his body taut as if bracing for something to unfold. A chill crept up Luna's spine, but she dismissed it, attributing her anxiety to the weather. Alexander's recent behavior struck her as odd, yet she couldn't determine whether she was projecting her own unease onto him or if there was something genuinely peculiar happening at night. As she lay in bed, Alexander assumed his usual place at the foot of the bed. This time, when Luna reached to scratch his ears, he seemed more insistent than ever, nudging her hand toward his face and pressing his body against hers with a surprising intensity. It was as if he was demanding her attention in an inexplicable way. She tried to brush it off as mere canine affection, but the discomfort lingered. "Goodnight, Alexander," Luna whispered, but he remained still. His body snug against hers as if waiting for her to act. For the first time in weeks, Luna couldn't escape the feeling that something was amiss. Days passed, yet the growing unease shadowed her interactions with Alexander. It wasn't just his constant proximity, his body always near hers, or the way he trailed her throughout the house. It was the shift in his gaze and intensity that seemed to transcend simple affection. It felt as though he was trying to convey something Luna wasn't sure she was ready to confront. One evening after a taxing day at work, Luna returned home to find Alexander stationed near the door waiting. There was no wagging tail, no joyful bark, only silence and a steady gaze, accustomed to his attention. Tonight it felt different. "Alexander," Luna murmured, her voice soft but strained. "What's going on with you?" He offered no response, and as she moved past him to hang her coat, she felt his eyes tracking her every motion. The stare was so penetrating it sent a shiver up her spine. Suddenly, Alexander edged closer, nudging her leg with his nose. She froze, her heart pounding for a fleeting moment. She thought she perceived something in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition, a desire that prompted her to step back. She couldn't explain it, but the air between them felt charged as if an unseen boundary had been breached. "Stop it, Alexander," Luna whispered, her voice trembling, but Alexander didn't back down. Instead, he pressed closer, seeking comfort in a manner that felt too intimate, too peculiar. Claire hailed deeply, pushing away the unsettling thoughts. She was reluctant to face the reality of their bond, the one she had unwittingly formed with Alexander. "He's just a dog," she told herself. Yet as Alexander pressed against her again, she couldn't help but question whether this was mere affection or something more complex. The subsequent days were fraught with tension. Luna couldn't ignore. Alexander's behavior became increasingly pronounced, his nudges more frequent, his closeness more persistent, and his presence felt in every room. Though he had always been a needy dog, this was different. It was as if he was trying to communicate something beyond a dog's usual capacity. Luna's mind raced. Was she overanalyzing? Was this merely a dog's natural need for companionship? Or was she witnessing something deeper, something darker that she couldn't grasp each night? As Alexander curled up beside her, the discomfort gnawed at her. She attempted to dismiss it to divert her attention, but the tension between them was undeniable. It wasn't just the physical proximity. It was the emotional intensity. Alexander seemed to occupy the void Jock had left his eyes, conveying an understanding that pierced through Luna. The feeling was becoming overwhelming, too powerful for her to ignore. Tension had been mounting for weeks, each day edging closer to a threshold. Luna feared she couldn't prevent her home once a refuge now felt stifling. Alexander's presence weighed heavily on her, the constant scrutiny of his gaze, his need to be near her to touch her, transcended affection and veered into obsession. A part of her had anticipated this, but now that it was reality, she felt trapped with no escape. That night, everything seemed to converge. Luna spent her day at work attempting to dismiss the oppressive weight of Alexander's presence. She hoped that staying occupied would alleviate the suffocating sensation, but as soon as she stepped through the door, the same intensity engulfed her. Relentless and consuming. Alexander awaited her, as he always did. Initially, it appeared to be a typical evening. He sat by the door tail-wagging, masking any underlying tension. But as Luna moved past to drop her keys, she noticed a difference. His stance was tense, his eyes locked onto her with a scrutiny that made her feel exposed. There was a deliberate in his movements, an urgency that hadn't been there before. She tried to dismiss it. "You're just being paranoid," she reassured herself. Yet a nod in her stomach suggested otherwise. Seeking clarity, she retreated to the kitchen. Alexander followed his footsteps, a soft rhythm against the floor, his focus unwavering. He settled by her feet, eyes deep and penetrating. The discomfort grew that night. When Luna went to bed, she felt Alexander's presence beside her. Initially content at the foot of the bed, he now insisted on being close. His presence was inescapable. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, attempting to soothe her mind. Yet she felt Alexander's eyes on her. When she turned, he was there, watching, his gaze unyielding. It was as though he awaited her acknowledgement of their bond. Luna swallowed her breath, shallow. "Why are you looking at me like that, Alexander?" She whispered into the silence, but Alexander offered no reply. He never did. He simply lay there, observing. Then, without warning, Alexander moved. He didn't just shift. He crawled toward her, his fur brushing against her skin. Luna's heart raised at his warmth, his closeness. She'd never felt so confined. She attempted to push him away, but he resisted. Alexander's body pressed into hers, refusing release. "Stop," Luna murmured, her voice trembling. "Please stop." But Alexander persisted. He nudged her again, pressing harder against her side. She sensed the tension in his muscles, the insistence in his actions. This wasn't about comfort anymore. It was something else, something unsettling. Luna felt a loss of control, a realization as sharp as a lightning strike. This wasn't mere affection, it was possessive manipulation, something darker. She recoiled, pulling away her back against the headboard, seeking space. But Alexander followed his warmth, unyielding, his breath steady and deliberate. It felt as though Alexander was compelling her to remain in this space, demanding the closeness he desired. Tears began to well in Luna's eyes, as the realization of her entrapment hit her with full force. She had never felt so helpless. Her fear wasn't solely of Alexander. It was also of herself, of what she had allowed to happen, how their bond had become so distorted. Her emotions, her thoughts were all tangled up in the tension that enveloped the room. There was no longer any denying what was happening between them. Her mind scrambled for a way out. She considered calling for help, fleeing the house, but deep down she knew those weren't options, not anymore. Connection between her and Alexander had grown too intense, too consuming. It was as if he could anticipate her every thought, leaving her powerless to resist. "Why is this happening?" Luna whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of her despair. She felt as if she were drowning in the suffocating atmosphere of the room, as if on cue. Alexander moved closer, resting his head against her ***T, his eyes closing briefly, but then he opened them again, and Luna felt his gaze like a silent command, a challenge she couldn't defy. "There was no turning back, please," Luna whispered, desperation in her voice, her hands trembling as she tried once more to push Alexander away, but he remained unmoved. He seemed stronger, now more determined. What once was a comforting presence had transformed into a force she couldn't control. She tried to convince herself this was all a misunderstanding, a fleeting moment of confusion. Yet deep inside she recognized the truth. This wasn't normal. It wasn't love. It was something far darker. As Luna lay trapped in the warmth of Alexander's body, she couldn't help but question how things had spiraled so far out of control. The night stretched on an oppressive silence, and Luna understood that whatever lay ahead, she was no longer the one steering her fate. Days blurred into one another, each more suffocating than the last. Luna's existence had become a fog of confusion, isolation, and fear. She had attempted to resist, to distance herself from Alexander, but each effort only seemed to draw him closer, more intensely connected. It wasn't just that he followed her. He was watching her constantly. She had tried reaching out to a friend, convincing herself she was overreacting, but the more she reflected, the clearer it became that she wasn't imagining things. Alexander wasn't just a dog anymore. He had become something else, something that had entwined itself so deeply into her life that she could no longer discern where she ended and he began. It wasn't love, it was possession, obsession. Luna couldn't bear it any longer. One evening she found herself standing before the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were hollow, her complexion pale, she hadn't been eating, barely sleeping, and when sleep came it was always with Alexander beside her. It felt as though she was fading away, becoming a mere shadow in her own life. Just another object for Alexander to dominate. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she whispered to her reflection, but only silence answered, only the soft, persistent tap of Alexander's paws as he entered the room. When Alexander approached her that night, Luna felt a chill run down her spine. He'd been more aloof in recent days, but tonight felt different. His eyes met hers, and for a moment Luna felt as if he could see right into her soul. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just leave me alone." But Alexander didn't respond. He simply sat there, staring at her with unblinking eyes. The silence in the room was oppressive. Luna backed away, retreating to the farthest corner, her heart pounding in her ***T. She knew she couldn't continue like this. She had to find a way out, but how? Where could she go? She couldn't escape. Alexander, not physically and certainly not mentally. He was woven into the fabric of her existence, a shadow in the depths of her soul. As Luna turned to leave the room, Alexander followed, always just a step behind, his presence looming like a dark shadow. Her breath hitched as she hurried toward the door, a desperate need to escape. Propelling her forward, she reached for the door handle, but Alexander lunged forward, blocking her path. "Alexander, no!" she cried out, her voice cracking as she attempted to push him away. But Alexander was stronger than she had ever imagined. His body pressed against hers, his fur a suffocating weight, his breath warm on her skin. He wasn't going to let her go. Not now, not ever. In that moment, Luna understood. This wasn't about love, it was about control, it was about Alexander's need to dominate, to possess her entirely, and she had allowed it to happen. She had let him become her everything, and now it seemed too late to unravel it. With a final desperate push, Luna broke free from his hold and fled the room. She didn't stop running until she was outside, where the cool night air hit her face. Even as she stood there gasping for breath, she felt Alexander's presence lingering as though he were still watching her every move that night. Sleep eluded her. She couldn't rest. Instead, she sat on the couch trying to devise a way out, but each plan felt futile. She had no one to turn to, no way to fight back. Alexander had become her reality, her living nightmare, and the most troubling realization was that she wasn't sure she wanted to escape somewhere deep inside. A part of her still yearned for the closeness, the intimacy that Alexander had provided. Even though it was suffocating, it felt like the only thing keeping her alive. The next morning, Celia awoke to an eerie silence. She hadn't slept yet, she felt oddly refreshed. The oppressive weight of the past days seemed to have lifted, though she knew it wouldn't last. Alexander was still there somewhere in the house. But for the first time, Luna felt a sense of resolve. She had to end it. The house felt different, emptier, as though something had shifted in the very air. Luna knew she couldn't continue living this way. She had endured too much, and now she faced the ultimate question.